My name was Marius Kell, and I was 27 Terran Standard years old when I learned that everything I believed about reality was a comfortable fiction. I was born on Cadia. Before it fell, before the planet cracked and the sky bled and everything we had fought to protect for 10,000 years collapsed into the warp. I was one of the lucky ones who wasn't there when it ended. Lucky. That's a word that tastes like ash now, because I survived Cadia's fall only to find something worse. Cadians are born soldiers. That's not metaphor or propaganda. It's literal truth. From the moment we can walk, we're trained to fight. My earliest memory is my father teaching me to field strip a laser gun at age 4, his scarred hands guiding mine through the motions. Charge pack release, barrel unlock, power cell extraction, reassembly. The ritual of maintaining weapons before we could read, before we understood what those weapons were for. "Why do we have to learn this, Papa?" I asked, my child's fingers fumbling with components too large for my hands. "Because Cadia stands between the Imperium and the Eye of Terror," he said, his voice carrying the weight of doctrine repeated so many times it had worn grooves in his consciousness. "Because we are the gate that must never open. Because the alternative to us standing is everyone dying. Do you understand, Marius?" I nodded, though I didn't understand. Not really. Not until much later, when I saw what came out of the eye when the gate faltered. When I learned that the monsters we held back weren't metaphors, but literal clawed things that wore physics like loose clothing and hungered for human flesh in ways that defied description. I served in the 847th Regiment. We were heavy infantry, standard Imperial Guard, nothing special. We deployed to war zones across the sector, fought orcs on Goran Prime, held the line against Dark Eldar raiders on Praxis 6, spent 6 months in trench warfare against heretic PDF forces on Corveth. Standard deployments, standard casualties, 63% attrition over 8 years, which the commissars assured us was acceptable loss rates for frontline units. Acceptable. Another word that stops meaning what you think it means when you watch your friends die in industrial quantities, and the Imperium's response is to ship in new soldiers to replace them, like they're replacing spent ammunition. We were stationed on the troop transport Indomitable Will when the orders came through. Emergency deployment to Nithra 7. Reports were fragmentary. Something about rebellion, chaos cultist uprising, civilian population compromised. Standard suppression operation. The briefing officer said we'd be in system for 3 weeks maximum. Crush the resistance, establish Imperial authority, extract. He was wrong about the timeline by approximately 4,000 years. Before I was Sergeant Marius Kell of the Cadian 847th. Before I was a soldier carrying a laser gun I could field strip blindfolded. Before I was another number in the Imperial Guard's endless casualty reports. I was just Marius, son of Gregor, a child who wanted to understand why the sky above Cadia was purple. My father was a simple man in the way that all Cadians are simple. Direct, practical, shaped by a lifetime of military service into someone who saw problems in terms of fields of fire and defensive positions. But he tried, in his way, to give me something beyond warfare. I remember one evening, I was 9 years old, between combat drills and weapons training. We sat on the roof of our hab block watching the Eye of Terror writhe in the night sky. That vast wound in reality dominated our horizon, a constant reminder of what waited if we failed. Most Cadians learned not to look at it directly, learned to treat it like background radiation, deadly but ignorable if you maintained proper precautions. But that night, my father pointed at it. "Do you see that, Marius?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual, lacking the parade ground certainty that usually defined him. "The eye," I said. Everyone knew what it was. We were taught about it before we learned our alphabet. "Yes. And do you know what it means?" I recited the catechism we were taught. "It's the realm of the Emperor's enemies, where the heretics and traitors fled after the War Master's betrayal. It's the wound that Cadia guards." My father was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I've never forgotten. Something that probably bordered on heresy, but he said anyway. "It means the galaxy is broken, Marius. It means there are places where reality itself has failed, where the universe doesn't work the way it's supposed to. And we stand here, on this world, with our laser guns and our faith, and we tell ourselves that's enough to hold back the fundamental wrongness of existence itself." "Is it enough?" I asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he put his hand on my shoulder. I can still feel the weight of it, the calluses on his palm from decades of weapons handling, and said, "The ecclesiarchy priests teach that the Emperor protects, that faith is armor, that belief matters. Maybe they're right. Or maybe we're just telling ourselves that so we can keep standing here, because the alternative is understanding how fragile everything is and going mad from the knowledge." "Which do you believe?" I asked. "I believe," he said slowly, "that I love you, and that you deserve a galaxy that isn't broken. But I can't give you that. So instead I teach you to strip laser guns and read tactical maps, and I pray to a corpse on a throne in terror, and I hope that's enough." He died 6 years later during a raid by Chaos cultists who came out of the eye-riding ships that screamed. I was 15. The last thing he said to me was, "Remember your training. Not, 'I love you.' Not, 'The Emperor protects.' Just remember your training." Because in the end, that was all Cadia had to offer its children: training, discipline, and the hope that when reality broke around us, muscle memory would carry us through. It didn't. The drop to Nithra. 7 went wrong from the beginning. We loaded into the transport landers in standard configuration. 40 soldiers per lander, full combat gear, 3 days' rations, ammunition sufficient for extended engagement. The indomitable will was in high orbit, and the plan was simple: rapid insertion, establish beachhead, suppress resistance, secure landing zones for follow-up forces. Standard Imperial Guard doctrine. We'd done it dozens of times. Lieutenant Corvus gave the pre-drop briefing in the lander's troop bay. He was a good officer in the way that Cadian officers are good, competent, no-nonsense, willing to die alongside his soldiers rather than behind them. I trusted him. We all did. "Listen up, 847th, he shouted over the lander's engine roar. "Intel reports Chaos cultist activity in the capital hive. Estimate 20,000 hostiles, poorly armed, minimal organization. Expect resistance, but nothing we can't handle. Our objective is to secure the main transit hub and hold it for reinforcement. Questions?" "Do we have air support?" Corporal Tyben asked. "Navy's providing orbital fire on request. Ground-based fighters were compromised when the PDF went traitor." "Estimated duration?" I asked. 3 weeks maximum, long enough to break the cultists' back, establish Imperial authority, extract standard suppression. He believed it, We all believed it, because believing was easier than questioning, and questioning orders was what heretics did, and we were loyal soldiers of the Emperor, or loyal soldiers of the Imperium that used the Emperor's name, which we had been conditioned to believe was the same thing. The lander shook as we hit atmosphere. That's when reality started coming apart. The first sign was the color. Through the viewport, I could see the sky, and it was wrong. Not purple like Cadia's eye-tainted heavens. Not the normal blue of a standard atmosphere. It was... I don't have words for the color. It existed somewhere between ultraviolet and a sound that makes your teeth ache, shifting through spectrums that human eyes aren't designed to perceive. "What is that?" Private Helen whispered, his voice carrying the edge of panic. "Atmospheric contamination," Lieutenant Corvus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Warp radiation from the cultist rituals. It'll clear once we're on the ground." It didn't clear. The second sign was the lander's instruments. The altimeter read 3,000 meters, then -700, then 6 million, then 0, cycling through impossible readings while the pilot's voice came over the Vox. "I'm getting conflicting data. Navigation is... Something's wrong with the gravitational." The third sign was that we crashed. Not gradually. Not with warning. One moment we were descending normally. The next the lander was tumbling, the world outside the viewport spinning in directions that shouldn't exist, and I felt my inner ear rebel as gravity became negotiable. Up was sideways, was inside out, was falling forever while standing still. The impact should have killed us. I remember the moment of collision, the shriek of metal tearing, the concussive force that turned the world white, the sensation of my body trying to occupy several different spaces simultaneously. I remember thinking very clearly, this is death. But it wasn't. When I opened my eyes, I was standing outside the lander, which was somehow both completely destroyed and entirely intact, depending on which angle I viewed it from. My squad was scattered around me, getting to their feet, checking for injuries, staring at a landscape that made their brains hurt. "Sound off!" Lieutenant Corvus shouted. "Status report." We counted. 40 soldiers loaded into the lander. 40 soldiers standing here now. No casualties. No injuries beyond bruises and disorientation. That should have been our first clue that normal rules had stopped applying. "Where are we?" Corporal Tybin asked. Lieutenant Corvus checked his auspex. The reading made him frown. "According to this, we're in the capital hive's outer district. Right on target." "Then where is the hive?" I asked. Because there was no hive. No city, no structures at all except the landscape itself, which rose and fell in angles that seemed to change when you weren't looking directly at them. The ground was a color I can only describe as the sound of screaming rendered as visual data. And the sky was worse. Layers of something that might have been clouds, or might have been the universe folding in on itself, and above it all that color that shouldn't exist, that spectrum that made your brain try to shut down rather than process what the eyes were seeing. "This isn't right," Private Helen said, his voice rising toward hysteria. "This isn't... The briefing said there was a city. There's supposed to be a city. We saw it from orbit. Where did it..." "Stow it, Private," Lieutenant Corvus snapped. Clearly the intelligence was corrupted. "We adapt. That's what Cadians do. That's when we saw the first body. It was one of ours, a guardsman from the 847th, wearing our regiment's colors, lying face down in the wrong-colored ground. Lieutenant Corvus approached carefully, laser gun ready, and rolled the body over. We all recoiled. It was Private Helen, the same Private Helen who was standing behind me, very much alive, staring at his own corpse with an expression of absolute incomprehension. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I'm right here. I'm alive. That can't be." The corpse sat up. It moved in joints that bent backward, its head rotating 180 degrees to look at us with eyes that were holes into somewhere else. Its mouth opened, and a voice that wasn't Helen's voice but sounded like what you'd get if you recorded Helen's voice and played it backward while drowning said, "You're already dead. You died in the crash. You've been dead for 3,000 years. You'll die in 17 minutes. All statements are true simultaneously. Welcome to Nithra 7. Then it collapsed back into the ground, which absorbed it like water absorbing a stone, and it was gone. Private Helen started screaming. He didn't stop for 4 hours, or 4 centuries. Both timescales are accurate, because time here doesn't flow in one direction. We tried to establish perimeter. Standard Imperial Guard protocol when landing in hostile territory. Secure the immediate area, set up defensive positions, send scouts to gather intelligence. The training was so deeply ingrained that we followed it automatically, even as everything about the situation screamed that normal protocols had stopped being applicable. Lieutenant Corvus divided us into 4 squads of 10. Squad Alpha would hold the crash site. Squad Beta would scout north. Squad Gamma would scout south. Squad Delta, my squad, would scout east. "Maintain Vox contact," Corvus ordered. "Report every 15 minutes. If you encounter hostiles, fall back to the crash site. If you find the hive, send up a flare. Move out." We moved out. The landscape resisted us, not actively. There were no enemies firing at us. No obstacles blocking our path. But the simple act of walking became complicated when distance and direction stopped being consistent. We would march for what felt like an hour, check our position, and discover we'd traveled 3 meters, or we'd take 10 steps and suddenly be a kilometer from the crash site. Or, and this was worse, we'd walk in a straight line and end up approaching the crash site from behind, having somehow circled around through a geography that didn't include curves. Corporal Tybin checked his chronometer. "We've been walking for 37 minutes. I checked mine. I show 14 minutes. Private Vex checked his. Mine says negative 6 hours. We compared chronometers. All 3 were running. All 3 showed different times, and somehow all 3 were correct. Time here wasn't a river flowing in one direction. It was a shattered mirror, each fragment reflecting a different moment, and we were somehow standing in all the fragments simultaneously. "This is wrong," Vex said, his voice tight with the kind of fear that even Cadian discipline couldn't fully suppress. "This is warp corruption. We need to—" That's when we saw them. Our own corpses. There were 10 of us in Squad Delta. Ahead of us, spread across the wrong-colored ground, were 10 bodies in Cadian uniforms wearing our regiment's colors. I approached the nearest one and felt my stomach drop. It was me. I was looking at my own corpse. It was old. Ancient, actually. The body had been exposed to elements for centuries, the uniform rotted to threads, the flesh mummified, the bones visible through desiccated skin. But the face was recognizable. It was my face, aged beyond its years, teeth bared in a final scream. "How long have we been dead?" Tybin whispered. "We're not dead," I said. but my voice lacked conviction. "This is warp trickery. Illusion. The Chaos cultists are trying to—" My corpse opened its eyes. "You've been dead for 4,300 years, it said in my voice, ancient and tired. You died in 17 minutes after landing. You'll die in 4 seconds. You're dying right now. The chronology is irrelevant here. We exist in all temporal states simultaneously." "Who are you?" I demanded. "I'm you," the corpse said. "I'm Marius Kell, who crashed on Nithra 7 with the 847th, who tried to understand what was happening, who spent 4 millennia going mad in loops of recursive time, who aged and died, and woke up young again and aged again in cycles. I'm your future, I'm your past, I'm your present moment extended across centuries of subjective experience compressed into minutes of objective time." "That's not possible," I said. "Possibility," my corpse said, "is a rule. Rules don't apply here. The warp has bled into this world so completely that causality is optional. You'll understand soon. You've already understood for thousands of years. You'll never understand because your brain will break before comprehension arrives." Then it dissolved, its body turning into something that looked like steam made of colors that don't exist. And the steam smelled like memories and tasted like the sound of my father's voice reading the Imperial Primer when I was 5 years old. I tried to report this to Lieutenant Corvus over the Vox. The Vox wouldn't connect, or rather, it connected to Lieutenant Corvus from 17 years ago, before Nithra 7, when he was a junior officer on a different world telling a different squad about a different deployment. He spoke to me across time, his voice confused, asking why I was calling him about things that hadn't happened yet, things that had already ended, things that were impossible. I cut the connection. "We need to get back to the crash site," I said to my squad. We tried. We walked for hours or minutes or centuries. All measurements were equally accurate. And when we finally reached what should have been the crash site, we found it occupied by ourselves. By which I mean Squad Delta was already there, setting up defensive positions, wearing the same uniforms, carrying the same weapons. There are 2 of each of us now, both versions equally real. Both versions equally confused, both versions trying to understand how we could be in 2 places simultaneously when we had only ever been in one place at any given time, because that's how identity and consciousness and basic fucking physics were supposed to work. The other me looked at me. I looked at the other me. We both opened our mouths to speak at the same instant and said in perfect unison, "This is impossible." And then time looped, and we were back at the moment just after the crash, standing outside the lander, listening to Lieutenant Corvus order us to scout east, experiencing the exact same sequence of events except we remembered the first time. Remembered meeting ourselves, remembered our corpses speaking. This was the first loop. There would be many more. The loops didn't repeat exactly. That would have been almost merciful. A clean cycle we could map and understand and potentially escape. Instead, each iteration was similar but different, like variations on a theme where the theme was reality has stopped making sense. Loop 2. We scouted east and found the city that hadn't been there before, except the city was built from materials that shouldn't exist. Buildings made of crystallized time, streets paved with compressed memories, street lights that cast shadows that showed what you would look like if you had made different choices 10 years ago. We entered the city and met the inhabitants, who were us, Thousands of versions of the 847th Regiment who had arrived in different loops and gotten trapped. They had been there for minutes and millennia, their consciousnesses fragmenting under the strain of experiencing non-linear time. Loop 3. We scouted east and found nothing, and the nothing was aggressive, a void that actively consumed space and left behind an absence that had texture and smell. The nothing touched Private Vex, and he ceased to exist. Not died, ceased. As in, had never existed. Except we all remembered him, which meant he had existed, which meant we were remembering someone who both was and wasn't real simultaneously. Loop 7. We never left the crash site. Time moved so slowly that a single second stretched across subjective centuries. I watched my finger move toward my laser gun's trigger and experienced the movement as a journey lasting decades. My hair grew and whitened during the motion. My thoughts slowed to geologic speeds, each neuron firing taking years to complete. By the time my finger reached the trigger, I was old, ancient, my body aged to dust while still maintaining the posture of a soldier about to fire. Loop 12. We scouted east and found ourselves already there, older, established, having built fortifications and shelter and a command structure. This version of the 847th had been on Nithra 7 for 300 years and had developed strategies for surviving the temporal chaos. They welcomed us, explained the rules they'd discovered, taught us how to navigate loops. Then the next loop began and they were gone, and we remembered their lessons but had no proof they'd ever existed. Loop 23. We died. All of us, simultaneously, not from enemy action, but from time itself, our bodies aging at differential rates so that our hearts were ancient while our brains were young, our bones dust while our flesh was fresh. We experienced death as a drawn-out process lasting centuries, consciousness persisting long after biological function ceased because here, death wasn't a state, but a process, and processes could be extended indefinitely. Then we woke up young again at the crash site, the loop resetting, and we remembered dying. Loop 31. We encountered the other regiments. Hundreds of Imperial Guard units had been deployed to Nithra 7 over the centuries, or over the minutes. Chronology was negotiable, and all of them were trapped in loops. We met Mordians who had maintained perfect formation discipline for 4,000 years while experiencing the same hour on repeat. We met Valhallans who had frozen in time literally, their bodies locked mid-motion while their minds continued to function. We met Katashans who had adapted to the temporal chaos by abandoning linear consciousness entirely, existing as probabilistic clouds of potential actions rather than discrete individuals. They all told variations of the same story. They deployed, reality broke, loops began, time stopped being linear, suffering became eternal, and none of them had found escape. Loop 47. I lost count of myself, by which I mean there were now 17 versions of Marius Kell existing simultaneously in the same approximate space-time coordinates. Some were young, fresh from the crash. Some were ancient, having lived subjective millennia. Some were dead but still conscious. Some were merged with the landscape, their bodies becoming part of the terrain while their minds remained aware. I tried to count myself and kept arriving at different numbers. I was one person. I was 17. I was infinitely divisible. I was a single consciousness, experiencing multiple timelines in parallel. All statements were true depending on how you defined identity, and the definitions kept changing. The original me, the one who had crashed with the 847th on day one, who still remembered my father's hands teaching me to strip laser guns, tried to maintain some sense of continuity. I carved marks into my armor to track loops. I kept a journal, writing down experiences so I could maintain narrative coherence. But the journal entries started contradicting each other. Events I remembered one way were recorded differently. Things I had written appeared in the journal before I wrote them. The act of maintaining memory became actively harmful as the memories contradicted each other, and my brain tried to hold mutually exclusive truths simultaneously. "We need to escape," I told Lieutenant Corvus during Loop 47. Or possibly told him during Loop 2 and was only now remembering it. Or would tell him during Loop 93 and was pre-remembering. The chronology was irrelevant. "Escape to where?" he asked. His hair was white now, though he was also still young, both states true at once. "In case you haven't noticed, Sergeant, there is no exit. Every direction we go leads back here. Every attempt to establish communication with orbit fails. Every time we try to die, we wake up young again. We're trapped in a moment that contains centuries, and the moment never ends." "There has to be a way," I said. "The Imperium will send rescue. They'll—" "The Imperium sent us," Corvus interrupted bitterly. "We are the rescue, and look how that turned out." He was right. We were supposed to save Nithra the Seventh from chaos corruption. Instead, we became part of the corruption, our very presence adding to the temporal chaos, our loops feeding the warp's hunger for causality violations. We weren't the rescue. We were more fuel for the fire. Somewhere around Loop 48, I stopped being entirely human. The transformation wasn't like the mutations we'd been warned about, the chaos corruptions that turned flesh into tentacles and bone into blades. This was subtler and somehow worse. My body remained mostly human-shaped, but my consciousness began to fragment in ways that couldn't be fixed. Time perception went first. I started experiencing events out of sequence. I would finish a sentence before starting it. I would react to stimuli before they occurred. I would remember futures that hadn't happened yet, but would happen inevitably in the next loop or the previous one, or both simultaneously. "Sergeant Kell, did you hear me?" Corporal Tyben asked during one loop. "Yes," I said, remembering his question from 3 loops ago or from 2 loops in the future. I couldn't distinguish anymore. "I haven't asked the question yet. You were going to ask how long we've been here. The answer is 17 minutes and 4,000 years, both measurements equally accurate, both failing to capture the actual subjective experience which cannot be quantified in linear time units." He stared at me. "How did you?" "Because we've had this conversation before. And we'll have it again, and are having it always in the eternal present that this world has become." Spatial perception went next. I began to perceive multiple locations simultaneously. I could see the crash site and the eastern wastes and the city that sometimes existed and the void that sometimes didn't, all overlapping, all occupying the same coordinates from different temporal/spatial perspectives. My brain tried to process this as separate images but failed, creating composite perceptions that made no physical sense. I watched Private Helen die in 17 different ways simultaneously, torn apart by angles, aged to dust, consumed by the nothing, merged with the ground, fragmented across timelines. All versions were real, all versions were happening. My mind held all 17 death sequences as concurrent truth. Identity dissolved somewhere around loop 127. I stopped being singular me and became plural we, not in the metaphorical sense, but literally. My consciousness split into multiple concurrent awareness streams, each experiencing different temporal positions simultaneously. One part of me was young Marius just after the crash. Another was ancient Marius 4,000 years later. A third was dead but aware Marius. A fourth was Marius merged with the landscape. All versions were me. None of them were me. The boundaries between them became negotiable. "Who are you?" Lieutenant Corvus asked during loop 156. "I am Sergeant Marius Kell. They said with multiple mouths across multiple timelines. I am the soldier who crashed here. I am the ancient man who lived millennia in loops. I am the corpse that still thinks. I am the consciousness that fragmented across probability streams. I am one. I am legion. I am dissolving into the temporal chaos while maintaining enough coherence to be aware of my dissolution. That's not an answer. It's the only answer that contains sufficient truth. Single answers are lies here, Corvus. The only honest response is contradiction, because contradiction is the fundamental nature of this place." His expression showed the kind of fear that even Cadian discipline couldn't suppress. The fear of watching someone you know become something incomprehensible while still wearing a familiar face. Loop 178. I tried to die permanently. I died dozens of times already in various loops, but death never stuck. I always woke up young again, the loop resetting, consciousness persisting regardless of biological cessation. But I was desperate enough by loop 178, or had been desperate for centuries, or would become desperate in future loops. The chronology was meaningless, to try systematic self-destruction. I put my laser gun under my chin and fired. The superheated energy beam vaporized my head. I died instantly, and immediately was aware of dying from multiple perspectives simultaneously. I experienced being the dead body, and the consciousness separating from it, and the version of me 3 loops earlier watching my future self die, and the version 17 loops later remembering having died. Death became another state to exist in, rather than an end to existence. I woke up young again, head intact, memory of dying perfectly preserved. "It doesn't work," a voice said behind me. I turned. It was me, an ancient version, body bent with age that shouldn't be possible for someone in his 20s, but I'd lived those centuries subjectively, and the body reflected it. I've tried to die permanently, 743 times across various loops, the ancient me said. Laser gun, knife, starvation, exposure, willing my heart to stop. Nothing works. Death here is just another loop state. You die, and then you're alive again, remembering death, experiencing death as ongoing condition while simultaneously being not dead. "Then we're trapped forever," I/Young said. "We've been trapped forever," I/Ancient said. "We will be trapped forever. We are currently trapped forever." All tenses are simultaneously accurate. Loop 203. The rescue arrived. They came from orbit in Valkyrie gunships, their engines screaming through the wrong-colored sky. Imperial Guard reinforcements responding to our distress signal. The one we'd sent 17 minutes ago, or 4,000 years ago, or would send in the next loop, depending on which timeline you measured from. The gunships landed. Soldiers disembarked. Fresh-faced guardsmen, young and whole, their uniforms clean, their eyes not yet hollowed by experiencing subjective millennia in minutes. 847th Regiment, their lieutenant called out. We're here for extraction. High Command received your distress call about the Chaos Uprising. We're pulling you out. We stared at them. By we, I mean the multiple versions of the 847th that existed simultaneously. There were hundreds of us now, fresh crashed soldiers, ancient veterans, living corpses, fragmented consciousnesses, all occupying the same approximate coordinates. The rescuers saw only 40 guardsmen, but we saw/were all iterations. Lieutenant Corvus stepped forward. He was young and old simultaneously, his hair both dark and white, his face both unlined and carved with centuries of suffering. "How long?" he asked carefully. "Has it been since we deployed?" 3 hours, the rescue lieutenant said. "You dropped at 0800 Imperial Standard. Current time is 1100. High Command wants you extracted before the Chaos forces regroup." 3 hours. We had been on Nithra 7 for 3 hours by the external universe's reckoning. We had been here for 4,326 years by our internal experience. Both measurements were accurate. Both were true. We had lived millennia in hours, aged centuries in minutes, died and revived thousands of times within a window that the outside universe measured as a lunch break. "You need to leave," I said to the rescue lieutenant. "You need to leave right now and never come back. This world it's not safe. Time doesn't work here. If you stay, you'll get caught in the loops. Sergeant, you're speaking nonsense," the rescue lieutenant said. His name tag read Vaughn. He looked like he was 18, maybe 19 Terran Standard. Young enough to still believe the propaganda about the Emperor's protection. "You're clearly suffering from combat stress. Get your men loaded into the gunships and we'll extract immediately." "You don't understand," Lieutenant Corvus said, and his voice carried the weight of millennia. "We've been trying to leave for 4,000 years. Every attempt to extract just becomes another loop. You landing here doesn't rescue us. It just adds you to the trapped population. You need to." Reality folded. That's the only way I can describe it. The space between the rescuers and us bent like paper being creased, and suddenly they were standing where we were standing, and we were standing where they had been, and both locations were the same location from different temporal perspectives. Lieutenant Vaughn blinked. "What was I?" He stopped, looked at his hands, his eyes widening. "Why are my hands old?" "I'm 19. Why do I remember being 19 for 400 years? "Oh no," Corporal Tyben whispered. "Not them too." The rescuers were aging in differential rates, their bodies experiencing time loops at accelerated pace because they hadn't built up the scar tissue of consciousness that we had. They lived through their first loop cycle in minutes, fresh arrivals to ancient veterans, to corpses, to fresh arrivals again, their faces cycling through ages, their screams overlapping across temporal streams. "Help us!" one of them shouted, his voice young and ancient and everything between. "What's happening? What? I remember dying. I remember dying 100 times. I'm 19. I'm 400 years old. He fragmented, his consciousness splitting into multiple parallel streams, and I watched him become what I had become, a collection of selves experiencing different timelines simultaneously. Identity dissolved into temporal chaos. The gunships tried to take off. They didn't. Or rather, they did take off, and also never took off, and also crashed, and also never arrived in the first place. All states were true simultaneously. The pilots experienced their own loop cycles, their perceptions fragmenting, their ability to distinguish between takeoff and landing and crashing, dissolving into temporal nonsense. More soldiers, more victims, more fuel for whatever warp horror had claimed Nithra 7 and turned it into this nightmare where time and space were suggestions that reality increasingly ignored. "We didn't rescue them," Lieutenant Corvus said, his voice hollow. "They didn't rescue us. We just added more prisoners to the temporal prison." Loop 204. More rescues arrived. Loop 215. And more. Loop 237. And more. Each Imperial Guard regiment sent to extract us became trapped in the same temporal chaos. Each rescue became another addition to the nightmare. We tried to warn them, tried to drive them away, tried to communicate across the gap between linear time and our fragmented existence. But they kept coming. Because the Imperium doesn't abandon its soldiers, the propaganda claimed. Because every life matters, the ecclesiarchy preached. Because the Emperor protects his faithful. Lies. The Imperium kept sending soldiers because we were resources they'd already invested in, and recovering investments mattered more than the actual people being recovered. The ecclesiarchy kept preaching protection because faith kept soldiers obedient, even as they marched into horrors. The Emperor protected nothing because the Emperor was a corpse, on a throne being used as a navigation beacon and a rallying symbol for a regime that ground its own citizens into components. By Loop 347, there were thousands of us trapped on Nithra 7. Hundreds of regiments, all experiencing subjective millennia in objective hours, all fragmenting under the strain of non-linear time, all becoming victims of the same warp corruption that we'd been sent to suppress. We had become the corruption. Somewhere around Loop 400, and I use around because numerical precision stops being possible when you're experiencing time as a probability cloud rather than a sequence, I achieved something like understanding. Not salvation, not escape, just comprehension of what had happened to us and why. Nithra 7 was a demon world, yes, but not in the simple sense that chaos forces had conquered it. The planet itself had become a warp wound, a place where the immaterium had bled so completely into reality that the distinction between material and immaterial ceased to exist. The warp operates on emotional/symbolic logic rather than physical causality. Desires manifest as entities. Thoughts become physically real. Time and space are malleable because they're not fundamental properties, but expressions of consciousness. When the Imperium sent us to suppress chaos cultist uprising, they sent us into a realm where physical laws had been superseded by warp logic. Our very presence, our consciousness, our memories, our desperate desire to escape, fed the temporal chaos. We wanted to go home. We wanted to survive. We wanted meaning, and the warp, which feeds on desire and suffering, granted our wishes in the most horrific way possible. It made us survive forever, trapping us in eternal loops. It made going home impossible so the desire would remain unfulfilled and continue feeding it. It made meaning into a joke. We served the Emperor's will by becoming permanent prisoners in the Emperor's name. "It's all meaningless," I said to Lieutenant Corvus during one of the later loops, when we were both ancient and young and dead and alive simultaneously. Everything we believed about duty and service and faith, it was programming designed to make us useful to the Imperium, and we served that purpose perfectly. We came here, got trapped, and now we exist as eternal fuel for warp corruption, forever loyal, forever suffering, forever serving a purpose we never chose. "Is there any escape?" Corvus asked. He'd been asking variations of that question for subjective millennia. "No," I said, "because escape is what we want, and here wanting something is the mechanism that prevents you from getting it. The only way out would be to stop wanting escape. But conscious beings can't choose to stop wanting. We're trapped by our own consciousness." "Then what do we do?" "We exist," I said. "We remember, we bear witness, not because it serves any purpose, but because we can't stop doing those things. We are awareness trapped in chaos, and awareness is all we have left." Loop 523. I stopped counting loops. The numbers stopped meaning anything. We had been here for 17 minutes and 10,000 years and eternity and no time at all. All measurements were equally true and equally false. The only constants were suffering and awareness of suffering. I had become a phenomenon rather than a person. My consciousness spread across so many timelines that I couldn't distinguish between me and not me anymore. I was Marius Kell. I was the thousands of versions of Marius Kell experiencing different moments simultaneously. I was the collective awareness of everyone trapped on Nithra, 7 sharing overlapping experiences. I was everything and nothing, and I remembered. I remembered my father's hands teaching me to field strip laser guns. I remembered the purple sky of Cadia. I remembered believing the Emperor protected. I remembered learning that belief was a lie. I remembered dying 7,943 times. I remembered the faces of every soldier in the 847th. I remembered futures that hadn't happened yet and pasts that kept changing. Memory became torture because memory was all I had, and memory of subjective millennia compressed into objective hours was too much for a human mind to hold without breaking. I broke. I had already broken. I would break in the future. I was currently in the process of breaking across multiple timelines simultaneously. All statements were true, which brings us to now. Except now doesn't have stable meaning here. Now is always and never, and 17 minutes after the crash, and 4,000 years after, and every moment between compressed into a single eternal present. The Imperium classified Nithra 7 as perdita, lost. They stopped sending rescue missions after the 17th Regiment failed to return. They marked the planet as a warp hazard and established quarantine protocols. But sometimes, in the material universe's time, not ours, ships approach Nithra 7. Survey vessels, scout frigates, sometimes civilian transports that have drifted off course. They detect us. Their Auspex readings show life signs. Thousands of Imperial Guard soldiers on the surface, power armor active, weapons armed. They detect distress signals, Vox transmissions, all the markers of a force requiring assistance. Some are foolish enough to investigate. They land, they disembark, they find us, ancient men in Cadian uniforms, bodies aged beyond possibility but still moving, still maintaining formation, still reciting imperial doctrines. 847th Regiment, they ask, as Lieutenant Vaughan once asked, as dozens of rescue lieutenants have asked across the centuries/minutes. Yes, we answer with voices that are young and ancient and every age between. We crashed 17 minutes ago. We've been here for 10,000 years. Both statements are true. Time doesn't work here. You need to leave immediately, or you'll become trapped like us. They never listen. They think we're suffering from combat stress or warp madness, or that our words are metaphors rather than literal descriptions. They try to help. They try to extract us. They enter the temporal chaos, and they become us. More prisoners, more victims, more consciousness fragmented across non-linear time, experiencing subjective eternities in objective moments. The cycle perpetuates. We've become a trap disguised as a rescue opportunity. Our very existence, our distress signals, our continued presence, lures more soldiers into the same fate. We try to warn them. We try to drive them away. But we're also desperate for contact, for help, for rescue after millennia of isolation. So we call out and we warn them away simultaneously, and both impulses are equally genuine, and both ensure that new victims keep arriving. During one of the eternal present moments, I've stopped tracking loops because tracking implies linearity, and linearity is a lie here. A tech priest arrived, not to rescue us, to study us. He was a mechanicus biologist, one of those adepts who view biological consciousness as defective software requiring debugging. He wore robes marked with the cog and skull, his face more metal than flesh, his eyes replaced with sensor arrays that perceived spectrums human eyes couldn't. "Fascinating," he said, watching us with clinical detachment. "Your temporal states are overlapping. You exist in quantum superposition across multiple timeline branches simultaneously. You've become living violations of causality." "Help us," Lieutenant Corvus said, or had said, or would say eternally. "Why would I help?" the tech priest asked. "You are valuable data. The Mechanicus has theorized about temporal displacement effects but never observed them directly. You represent confirmation of 17 hypotheses about warp reality interaction. Your suffering serves the Omnissiah's quest for knowledge. The Omnissiah, the machine god that Mechanicus texts claimed existed in the warp, blessing technology and granting sacred knowledge to faithful tech priests. Another false god. Another lie painted over exploitation, this time exploiting humans for experimental data instead of battlefield service. Your Omnissiah doesn't exist, I said with multiple voices across multiple timelines. It's Mechanicus propaganda, a theological framework constructed to justify hoarding technology and calling maintenance prayer. You're not serving a god, you're serving an organization that uses divine language to enforce information control. The tech priest's expression, what remained visible beneath cybernetics, showed something like surprise. You've become heretical in your imprisonment. We've become clear, I said. Suffering strips away comfortable lies. We spent millennia praying to the Emperor for rescue. The prayers went unanswered because there's no Emperor to answer them, just a corpse the Imperium uses as a symbol to enforce obedience. We spent centuries maintaining faith that service mattered. It doesn't. We were tools that broke, and broken tools get discarded or studied, and you're here for the latter. Your analysis is correct, the tech priest said. You are tools. Valuable tools now, due to your unique temporal state, but tools nonetheless. The Imperium functions by converting human resources into useful components. Sometimes those components are soldiers. Sometimes they're data subjects. Your purpose has changed, not ended. He deployed instruments, sensors and recorders and devices I couldn't name. He measured our temporal states, documented our suffering, recorded our memories. "The Emperor protects," he said while working, his tone suggesting the phrase was a ritual invocation rather than believed statement. "The Omnissiah provides. Faith serves function." "You don't believe any of that," I said. "Belief is irrelevant," he replied. "The words serve their purpose regardless of the speaker's faith. They maintain social cohesion. They provide psychological comfort to those who need it. They enforce behavioral patterns useful to the Imperium. Truth and belief are separate categories." He was right, of course. The Mechanicus had always been more honest than the Ecclesiarchy about the instrumental nature of religion. They worshipped the Omnissiah not because they believed in its divinity, but because the theological framework served organizational purposes. Faith as tool rather than truth. The tech priest finished his measurements and prepared to leave. "Will you report what you found?" Lieutenant Corvus asked. "Yes. The data will be archived in the Mechanicus vaults on Mars. Perhaps in several centuries when the Imperium's political situation stabilizes. Someone will review the research and determine whether your suffering has generated actionable intelligence. And us. You will continue to exist here. Your temporal state is stable in its way. You cannot die permanently. You cannot escape. You will remain as living laboratories, generating data on temporal anomalies for as long as the warp maintains Nithra 7's corrupted state." "That could be forever," I said. "Yes," the tech priest agreed. "But consider, you wanted your service to matter, to mean something. It does. You generate valuable experimental data. Your suffering serves the Omnissiah's quest for knowledge and the Imperium's understanding of warp phenomena. Purpose achieved." Then he left, his ship translating out of orbit, leaving us alone again in our eternal present of fragmented time. And I realized he was a mirror. The Mechanicus viewed us as data sources, valuable only for what could be extracted from our suffering. But that was exactly how the Imperium viewed all its citizens, as resources to be converted into useful components, as tools to be employed until they broke. The only difference was that the Mechanicus was honest about it. We had always been tools. We had just spent millennia learning that truth. This is what I want you to understand, whoever you are, whatever time you're reading this from. The Imperium will tell you that service is noble, that sacrifice matters, that your suffering serves a grand plan. They will tell you the Emperor protects, that faith is armor, that loyalty is rewarded. They're lying, not because they're evil, though many are, but because the system requires those lies to function. The Imperium operates by converting human beings into components, soldiers, workers, servitors, data subjects. The conversion process requires cooperation, and cooperation is easier when people believe their exploitation is meaningful. So they dress exploitation in theological language. They call slavery service, and torture testing, and death sacrifice, and programmed obedience faith. They teach you that suffering proves you matter to the Emperor, when the truth is that suffering proves you're useful to the Imperium, and the Imperium is not the Emperor, And the emperor is not a god, but a corpse being used as a symbol. We learned this truth the hard way. We deployed to Nithra 7, believing we served something greater than ourselves. We believed the emperor would protect us, that faith mattered, that our loyalty meant something. We believed because we'd been conditioned to believe, programmed to accept those assertions as axiomatic truth. The programming failed when confronted with reality that didn't respect the rules the programming was built on. We've been trapped here for 17 minutes and 10,000 years. We've died and live and died again in loops that never resolve. We've aged millennia while our bodies remain young. We've fragmented across timelines until we can't distinguish between self and not self. And through all of it, the Emperor has not protected us. The Imperium has not rescued us. Faith has not sustained us. Loyalty has not been rewarded. We are tools that broke, and broken tools are left to rust. If you're reading this, if you're an Imperial Guardsman being deployed to some hell world, if you're a citizen being told your suffering serves the God Emperor's plan, if you're anyone who's been taught that faith in the Imperium equals salvation, please understand you are not saved. You are used. You are not protected. You are expended. Your suffering does not matter to the powers that invoke the Emperor's name while grinding you into components. Find meaning elsewhere, in brotherhood, in personal honor, in service to actual humans, rather than to the Imperium that processes humans like raw material. Find it anywhere except in the promises of false gods and the propaganda of a regime that views you as ammunition. Because if you trust those promises, if you believe the lies, you'll end up like us, trapped, suffering, eternal, loyal even in damnation to a corpse god who never protected us, and an Imperium that forgot us the moment we stopped being useful. My name is Marius Kell. I'm 27 years old and 4,326 years old simultaneously. I have been trapped on Nithra 7 for 17 minutes and will remain trapped for eternity. I am one consciousness and thousands of fragmented selves experiencing non-linear time. I am a warning. This is what I'm warning you about. The Emperor does not protect. He never did. And faith in protection that doesn't exist will not save you when reality stops playing by the rules you were taught. Remember us. Remember that we were soldiers who believed. Remember what belief cost. In the space that is Nithra 7, a place that exists and doesn't exist, that occupies coordinates in the material galaxy while simultaneously being pure warp stuff, we continue. The 847th Regiment maintains patrol routes through landscape that changes with each observation. We hold defensive positions against enemies that never attack. We await rescue that arrived and failed and will arrive again and has never arrived simultaneously. We are young soldiers fresh from the crash, and ancient men who lived millennia in minutes, and corpses that still think, and consciousnesses merged with the terrain and probability clouds of potential selves and all states in between. Lieutenant Corvus still gives orders, his voice young and ancient, and every age between. Corporal Tybin still checks his chronometer, which reads 17 different times simultaneously, all of them correct. Private Helen still screams, has been screaming for 4,000 years, will scream forever, because in the eternal present, his terror never resolves. And I, Marius Kell, son of Gregor, born on Cadia, trained as a soldier before I understood what soldiering meant. I remember my father's hands teaching me to maintain weapons. I remember believing the Emperor protected us. I remember learning that protection was propaganda. I remember dying 7,943 times. I remember every loop, every iteration, every moment of the 17 minutes that lasted millennia. And I exist here, in this eternal now, this moment that contains centuries and seconds equally. This trap disguised as a world, this laboratory where human consciousness breaks against the reality that time is a rule and rules don't apply when the warp bleeds through. We are the Cadian 847th. We deployed to Nithra 17 minutes ago. We have been here for 10,000 years. We will be here forever. All statements are true. The Emperor protects nothing. He never did. And we're still here, waiting for rescue that has already come and will never arrive and is currently arriving and never existed. Because in this place all possibilities are equally real and equally false and equally eternal. Remember us, not because remembering will save you, but because someone should know that we were human once, before time became a prison and existence became a loop, and faith became a joke we no longer understand. My name is Marius Kell. I am dying here. I have been dying for 4,000 years. I will die in 17 minutes. All chronologies are accurate. All are eternal. None mean anything. Welcome to Nithra 7. We've been waiting for you. We always will be. On a world that exists in 17 different temporal states simultaneously, a regiment of soldiers maintains formation. They are young and ancient and dead and alive. They patrol terrain that shifts with each observation. They guard against threats that exist in potential states rather than actuality. And in the center of their formation, a sergeant stands at attention, his hair dark and white simultaneously, his face unlined and carved with millennia of suffering. My name, he says to no one, and everyone and himself across timelines, is Marius Kell. The words echo across 4,000 years, compressed into 17 minutes. The Emperor does not protect. The landscape shifts, the moment loops, time folds back on itself. He is 27 years old. He is ancient beyond measure. He has been here forever. He has just arrived. All statements are true. The eternal present continues. Forever.